All right. Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Fire Breathing Rob. Thanks so much for listening. We have a very special guest who I've been a huge fan of throughout my 31 years of life right now. I've listened to him for quite a long time in college and even before that in high school. And this is Thom Hartmann. He is a progressive radio talk show host and also an author, and he's authored many books. We're going to talk about those, but his newest book that's out right now is The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. But Thom, thanks so much for coming on the program. It's truly an honor.
It is a pleasure to be here with Fire Breathing Rob. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, Thom. So let's kick this around. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about what got you involved in politics and how you became a progressive growing up in Michigan?
Well, I started my interest in politics because my dad was a Republican activist in Lansing. I mean, this was in the 1950s and early 60s. And in fact, in 1964, when I was 13, I went door to door with my dad for Barry Goldwater. Within a year or two of that, I had moved out to East Lansing. I was attending Michigan State University and got involved in the anti-war movement and SDS. And my dad and I went separate ways politically, although we remained close. And, it was really SDS and the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement of the 60s that woke me up politically. And I've pretty much been there ever since.
I do want to just jump right into and speak about the book because that's the main topic here. And we're talking about Thom's new book, Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. So what made you want to write a book on this topic? And also, can you give the viewers a small synopsis of the book?
Sure. Well, what got me interested in the topic was that I have been an entrepreneur my whole entire life. I started my first business when I was 15 or 16 years old. And my wife Louise and I have started and built up 7 or 8 businesses, 4 or 5 of them pretty successful over the years. And increasingly what I'm learning and seeing all around me is that the ability to be an entrepreneur, to start a small business, particularly a local business that might serve the local community, and ideally one that you can build over the course of your life and maybe even pass along to your children, a local dry cleaner store, or Five and Dime, or a diner, or a restaurant, or a motel, or even, a bank or an internet service provider, any of those kinds of things. You just can't do it anymore because every single sector of American business is now dominated by a small handful of very, very powerful companies that operate in concert with each other as a monopoly, or as, technically an oligopoly, but, I think we can call them monopolies. And what that has done is make it really, really difficult to start up unless you've got really deep pockets or you can get venture capital, which is, kind of monopolized in and of itself. So that was my starting point. As I dug into the research on monopoly and going literally all the way back to the founding of America, what I found was that there was an understanding, and Adam Smith actually first talked about this Wealth of Nations that was published in 1776, and even more extensively in his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, a few years later, is that for capitalism, which is only, modern capitalism is really only 300 years old. For capitalism, monopoly is very much like cancer is in the body. In our bodies, we have cells that are reproducing constantly, and occasionally they mutate, and most of those mutations just die, they don't work. But occasionally a cell will mutate in a way that causes it to be able to live forever and reproduce forever. And that cell will then go, I am the one who's going to take control of this body, and I'm going to take all the nutrients, and I'm going to be the biggest cell in the body. And it grows and it grows and sends out, its own blood vessels and things, and starts sucking down the energy from the body. And we call that cancer, and that tumor gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as it does so, the whole rest of the body gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Remember Steve Jobs, a month or so before he died, he looked like he was from Auschwitz. It's because that tumor was consuming all the energy of his body. And it keeps doing that until it eventually kills the host. Well, in capitalism, monopolies do the same thing. You've got one company or a small handful of companies that say, we are going to take all the money. We're going to get everything. Nobody can do commerce in this sector unless they do it through us. And the result of that is all kinds of economic distortions, distortions in the marketplace, distortions in the labor marketplace, distortions in the financial marketplaces, and ultimately the death of the host, that is the death of capitalism. And we are full-blown, full-bore. Ronald Reagan in 1982 stopped enforcing the antitrust laws in this country, the anti-monopoly laws. And here we are 38 years later, and that cancer has damn near consumed our country. The average family in America is spending $5,000 a year more than average families in any other developed country in the world, because we are the only developed country in the world that aggressively does not, that intentionally fails to enforce anti-monopoly laws. And so we pay 2 to 3 times as much, in some cases 5 times as much, for internet service as anywhere in the world. And by and large, that service is crappy. We pay more than twice as much for cell phone service as anybody in the world. We pay from 2 to 50 times more for pharmaceuticals from anybody else in the world. We pay more for food than any other developed country in the world. We pay more for clothing. I mean, about the only area where we're still paying cheap prices is the cheap crap that's coming in from China or from third world countries that breaks constantly. You know, I had a toaster for years and years that I inherited through my mother from my grandmother that was made in 1948. And, you know, and it worked until just a few years ago. I've gone through 3 toasters since then. You know, you buy them and they just break. It's crazy. And so that's where we're at now. It's just, you know, we are in monopoly land. We're screwed. And not only that, these companies, not only do they control the marketplace, but they also control effectively the labor marketplace. And so, you know, since Reagan stopped enforcing the monopoly laws, we've seen wages completely flatten. People right now, individuals are making less than they were when Reagan became president, and family take-home pay is about the same as it was when Reagan became president. But today, on average, 2.2 people are working in a family, and when Reagan became president, it was 1.2 people. So that's where we're at as a result of monopoly.
With so much money in politics, and these corporations keep contributing to these campaigns, how can we break these monopolies up? You know, you look at Senator Sanders, who I know you're friendly with, in his 2 runs for president, I believe he got screwed out of both runs. And even Elizabeth Warren, who is a progressive, but she can play to the middle of the base too with the Democrats. And she wanted to break up big tech, and they even try to push her around. So, you know, with progressives running and basically getting screwed all the time, and these are the policies that they're pushing to break up big tech, to break up these monopolies in general, they can't win these elections because they're getting screwed by big money, you know, campaign contributors.
Yeah, and let's just make it very, very clear that if these big monopolies were broken up, it would revitalize American business. We had better growth, annual GDP growth, and better wage growth for working class people from the 1940s until the 1980s than we have had since Reagan changed the rules of the games of capitalism. So yes, spot on. With regard to you know, monopolies like Walmart and Amazon and whatnot, I mean, Amazon has succeeded in creating not only, you know, horizontal monopolies but vertical monopolies as well. It's just breathtaking, the market power that they have. Part of that was that government gave them, you know, we with the Telecommunications Act, we gave them a pass on paying state sales tax, so they could unfairly compete with every bookstore in America to begin with, and ultimately every store, period. They're just now very recently starting to pay sales taxes. But beyond that, I mean, you know, that's kind of a piece of it. But beyond that, they have, Amazon in particular they're using their market power. For example, they know if you're buying a toaster, for example, toasters are probably a bad example because there's not as much of a mass market. Say batteries, you know, you're regularly buying AA batteries or AAA batteries. Well, what Amazon has been doing is they've been looking at what is it that people buy a lot of, and then they'll find a company in China that will make that just for them, a private label version of it. So now you get Amazon batteries, you can get Amazon food products, you can get, Amazon tools, I mean, you name it. And they're growing this every single day. And in the process, pushing out of business or pushing out of the marketplace, the companies and their products that they started out selling. I mean, this is what John Rockefeller was doing with oil in the 1890s. And it's what Senator Sherman, with the Sherman Antitrust Act, went after him for. With Facebook has been growing the same way that Rockefeller grew the oil, the Standard Oil monopolies as well. What Rockefeller would do is he would buy out his competitors, and those who refused to get bought out, he would drop prices and wipe them out. And that's certainly, I mean, Facebook acquiring Instagram, and that's one of about 100 companies that they bought. They're doing the same thing. So really, since 1982, when Reagan said in 1982, we're not going to enforce the antitrust laws anymore, it kicked off an era referred to as the M&A mania. And talk to anybody who was around in the 80s. They remember it well. There was Michael Milken, greed is good, and all this kind of stuff, the movie Wall Street. And Milken referred to himself as an M&A artist. These guys called themselves the masters of the universe. And really what they were doing was they were taking all these companies and smashing them together and laying off lots and lots of people, because if you take 5 companies and each one has its own HR department, its own accounting department, its own marketing department, you smash them all together, now you only need one accounting department, one marketing department, one sales, et cetera. And so you could lay off lots and lots of people. This led to lots of unemployment over the last 38 years, and which is more efficient, yes, technically, but again, at the cost of locking others out of the marketplace. Certain amount of inefficiency is actually a good thing in an economy. And, here we are as a result.
Thom Hartmann here on Fire Breathing Rob. Definitely check out his book, The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. When are we going to start seeing people that are progressive, people that are in the streets, that are pushing Black Lives Matter, try to push economic protests, talk about unions, talk about raising that minimum wage to $15 or even beyond in places like New York, Seattle, where you can't even afford to live on $15 an hour. When are we going to see this? Because the Democrats and the Republicans and President Trump, of course, have not done a damn thing for workers right now in a time where people aren't working. There's environmental crises all over the country right now. The whole U.S. is like a disaster scene in a movie right now. So when are people going to wake up and stop protesting against the establishment in a time where we need money and we're not getting any help from the government, Democrat or Republican?
Well, part of the problem, Rob, is that most people under 40 don't even understand the value of a union because they didn't grow up in a world in which unions were a major player. When I was a kid, back in the old days, before Reagan, we had 2 newspapers out of Detroit, the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News. One was the business paper. It had a business section. The other was a labor paper. It had a labor section. And it talked about, what the unions were doing and what, union jobs were out there and, all these kind of stuff. That's all gone now. When Reagan came into office, a third of America was unionized. Another third of America had the equivalent of union jobs because the union jobs set the local floor. And when Reagan, declared war on unions with Patco in the first weeks after he became president, one of only 2 unions that had endorsed him, and he destroyed that union. And, by 1992, and by that election, 12 years later, Bill Clinton had to turn, the unions were no longer able to fund and defend the Democratic Party. He had to go to big corporations, hat in hand. A lot of this, to go back to an earlier comment you made, Rob, a lot of this goes back to 2 Supreme Court decisions in 1978, 76 and 78. In 1976, prior to 1976, if an individual billionaire, back then they were multimillionaires, but let's just use that for shorthand. If an individual billionaire owned a politician so completely that they were the major donor to that politician, that person in all probability wouldn't have political power or office without them. And that politician regularly proposes and passes and votes for legislation that would benefit that billionaire. We used to call that bribery. We used to call that corruption. We used to call that political capture, and it used to be against the law. In 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, ruled that no, that's not bribery, that is not capture, that's not corruption. Instead, that billionaire's money is not even money; it's speech. It's like it's talking. Dollar bills talking, and because it's speech, the First Amendment protects it. 2 years later, in 1978, in a case called First National Bank versus Bellotti, and I wrote another book about this, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. 2 years later, in that Bellotti case, the Supreme Court said, oh, by the way, we're going to extend that logic to corporations as well. And so that, set up Citizens United in 2010. So one of the major challenges that we have is that big business and Republicans and conservatives in general, let's say, have a symbiotic relationship. The businesses support the conservatives vote for things that support the businesses. Progressives come along and say, we're here for the workers, we're here for the people, and the people can't write $1 million checks or $5 million checks or $50 million checks like the businesses can or the billionaires can. And so it's a very lopsided battle because the Supreme Court changed the rules of the game of politics. To arguably your first question, which is, how do we change this or what can bring it about? If you look at the history of the United States, what you find is the moments of the greatest progressive change are almost always tied to a crisis. Whether it was Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society, which was tied to the crisis of the assassination of John Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal, which was tied to the crisis of the Republican Great Depression, the end of slavery, and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which was tied to the crisis of the Civil War, or the American Revolution itself, which was tied to the crisis of the great crash of 1770 and a battle that the colonists had with the largest monopoly in the world, the East India Company, in 1773. We call that the Boston Tea Party. In every single case, there was a major economic crisis that became a political crisis that cracked open the door enough that real serious political change could happen. I think the Trump presidency has produced that crisis again. The coronavirus is helping, but frankly, I think even without the coronavirus, our economy had already started to slow down last year before we even knew about the coronavirus. And by February of this year, when we only had one case in the United States, or maybe 3 or 4 cases, we were already starting to slide into recession. And, because, hey, the expansions only last so long. This is the longest in history. So I think that we're at one of those moments right now, Rob, where if the rest of us can get out there and become fire breathers too, we can actually produce some meaningful change.
Agreed. Thom, I want to get into a little election 2020 talk, but I just want to speak about your radio show and talk a little bit about that. And if you haven't heard Thom, definitely check him out. I listen to you on YouTube consistently. But let's talk about this. So what made you want to start a radio show?
In November of 2003, or maybe it was 2002. Yeah, it was November of 2002. Louise and I were living in Vermont. My parents and my 3 brothers and their families all live in Michigan, which is where I grew up. And we drove from Vermont back to Michigan for Thanksgiving. And all the way there, every little town, I would tune the dial on the radio looking for talk radio. I love talk radio. And I started in radio when I was 16, only it was music radio. And I was a DJ for 3 years and I did news for 7 years. So anyhow, I'd be looking for talk radio, and all I could get was right-wing talk radio. In fact, we heard the Sean Hannity show 3 different times. Time shifted as we were traveling across the country, and he was doing this Habitat for Humanity thing, saying, "No liberal's going to get this house." And I thought, somebody's got to be talking back to these people, and nobody is. And so I wrote an op-ed called Talking Back to Talk Radio. It was published in late 2003 in commondreams.org. It's still up there on their website. And 2 venture capitalists in Chicago, Shelley and Anita Drobny, read that, called me up, said, "Hey, can you come out to Chicago and talk to us?" I flew out there, and they said, "We've got this idea. We've got some money. We've got some investors. We want to put together a progressive radio network. We want to call it Air America. And would you help us?" And so I helped them. I wrote their first business plan. In fact, Shelley published it and my article published it in his book, The Road to Air America. And But by that time, I had already started my own show. I wanted to prove that what I was saying was possible. That not only could you do progressive radio and have a positive impact and catch an audience, but you could also make a living at it. And you know, it took a couple of years for me to make a living at it, but you know, we did that. And we've been doing the show continuously now for what, 16, 17 years. And you know, it just kind of grew from there.
Well, what happened to Air America? I mean, I remember Air America very faintly. You know, I was young at the time, but I remember Al Franken was on there, Stephanie Miller, Randy Rhoads, you, of course, too. What happened to that station? Was that that station took a dive for the worse because of that 1996 telecommunications bill, or was it just because of ratings? What was the reason why that took a dive?
There were several factors. One of them was that most of the stations that they were either leasing space on or that had simply picked up their programming were Clear Channel stations. Clear Channel is a company that after the 96 law went from being a small regional owner of a couple of radio stations to owning over 1,000 radio stations in America in every major market. Clear Channel got taken over by Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's company, and they started dumping progressive programming. As they were dumping progressive programming, it was harder and harder to sell advertising and sponsorships because the audience was shrinking. When Air America finally declared bankruptcy, their total bankruptcy was for $17 million. Compare that to Fox. Rupert Murdoch came in and created Fox News. I think it was in 96, I think he started it. And he lost $100 million a year, according to Brett Hume, for the first 5 years before he made a profit. The losses declined over those 5-year period, but basically $100 million a year. You know, they lost about $500 million before they started making money because they had a billionaire behind them and he was willing to do whatever it took. What Air America's bankruptcy was, you know, chump change compared to that. But the simple fact of the matter is that the vast majority of billionaires in America support conservative causes because conservatives say, hey, cut the taxes on billionaires. And progressives are saying, hey, raise the taxes on billionaires. So there's a very small number of really wealthy people on the left, and they tend to be doing all kinds of things and they're all over the map. It's a really sad story, Rob. It really is. You know, there was some mismanagement, you know, within the network as well. But I think that basically, you know, just being underfunded was their biggest crime.
And I know as a Bernie Sanders guy myself, voted for him in 2016 and 2020 in both primaries. I remember you used to have that segment Tuesdays with Bernie. You were close with him. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about what Bernie is behind the curtain, how he acts, how he is personally, how you even met him in general?
Bernie is the same guy in person that he is when you see him on TV or anywhere else. You know, Bernie is one of the absolutely most consistent people I've ever met in my life. He, in my experience, I'm not like a close personal friend of his. I talked to him literally every week for 11 years that he was on my show. And, you know, we met quite a few times in person. But he's a pretty private guy, you know, in terms of his private life. And really, you know, his passion, the love of his life, the thing that he has committed his life to is progressive politics, is the fate and future of the American middle class, working class people, and poor people. And he wakes up every morning thinking about that, and he goes to sleep every night thinking about that. And I don't think I've ever met in my life anybody who was so consistent and had such a high level of integrity as Bernie Sanders.
I want to talk about 2020. As a progressive, just like you are, Tom, you know, I'm extremely worried about Joe Biden winning. I'm in Florida right here. I consistently see Trump banners, Trump flags, Trump bumper stickers, the MAGA hats. I know these supporters are fired up. I live near these supporters. As a Sanders supporter, I'm not the person that's going to say, you know, I'm not voting for Joe Biden. I'm going to vote for Joe Biden because, honestly, I'm deathly scared if Donald Trump wins again. I think that I could see a race war if Trump wins again. But I am worried about this, Tom, and I want to get what your take is with this. With Bernie Sanders supporters as far as not even brought into the policy fold right now. Joe Biden, and we saw in the conventions, he's targeting these moderate Republicans, John Kasich, Colin Powell. There's not a lot of those people out in the country right now that are moderate Republicans. They targeted the white suburbanites, but there's no progressives. That is the base of the Democratic Party. That's like 45 to 50% of the Democratic Party. A lot of these people that are young, my age, they don't feel wanted like the Democratic Party. They feel like they're the forgotten man, like Donald Trump says. Not that these people are going to vote for President Trump, but they feel forgotten. You know, so are you worried about Joe Biden's chances because of these issues that I just brought up?
I have always thought that a base strategy on the Democratic side would be the most effective strategy, rather than, you know, a kind of middle of the road milquetoast strategy. Right. And I would have and would be running the Biden campaign somewhat differently than they are. But that said, I think it's really important, Rob, that we remember that, you know, the most progressive politician on the Democratic side, well, of any side really, in the history of the United States, I would say, was Franklin Roosevelt. Yes. In 1932, at the depths of the Great Depression, he campaigned on balancing the federal budget and lowering tariffs. That was his big thing. And of course, when he got into office, you know, he looked out at the country and said, you know, that's not what the country needs. And he changed America. I mean, major change. You know, he created unemployment insurance, Social Security, you know, long-term unemployment. You know, the list just goes on and on and on. Obviously, so I'm, you know, this great man theory of history, which is kind of an extension of the salvationist thinking that's at the core of many of the monotheistic religions. You know, some person is going to save us. Jesus is going to save us. And so, you know, by proxy, we're saying, well, Joe Biden will save us or Bernie Sanders will save us. You know, yeah, leadership is important and there's a certain skill set associated with leadership, but I don't think that that's the beginning or the end of it, frankly. I really think that the way politicians work is they don't start parades, generally speaking. Or if they do, it takes them 40 years like it did with Bernie. Instead, what they do is they look out and they say, where's the parade today? Who's got the biggest parade? Oh, there's a parade over there. I'll jump in front of that, hoist my flag and say, this is my parade. And so the work that we have to do is create the parade. We have to be out there. We have to be present. We have to let them know that we're here. I'd say the same thing about Lyndon Johnson, by the way. Lyndon Johnson was a conservative Democrat and a fairly racist Democrat from Texas, for God's sake, who you know, came up through Texas politics brutally. I mean, you know, just the LBJ's political history just is shocking. And this is the guy who brought us the Civil Rights Act, who brought us the Voting Rights Act, who brought us Medicare, who brought us Medicaid, who brought us food stamps, who brought us Head Start, I mean, just all these programs that came out of the Great Society, because he knew the direction the country was moving. He figured out where the parade was. I'm pretty confident that Joe Biden and particularly Kamala Harris are smart enough politicians that once they have power, I mean, right now for them to try to debate Green New Deal or Medicare for all or anything would be I think, frankly, a distraction and one that probably wouldn't play well, given how Republicans would lie about it all. But once they have power, I'm fairly confident if people like you and me, Rob, can continue, you know, pushing them and awakening and pulling together the American people to be a presence, you know, a voice in their ear, that we can change these things. And the final piece to that is for all of us to get as involved as we can with our local Democratic parties. You know, the Democratic Party kind of went to hell in the 90s with Bill Clinton and the DLC, and it's recovering slowly. It's you know, back to its progressive roots. You know, and as the conservatives are being basically marginalized in the party. I think that's a good thing. And for those people who want to complain about the Democratic Party, I get it. The solution is volunteer to become a precinct committee person. You know, the precinct committee people are the most powerful people in politics. They're the ones who decide who's going to run in the primary. They're the ones who write the platforms. I mean, that's where the real power is. And usually those jobs, you know, local parties are begging for people to volunteer for those jobs. So there's so many ways that people can get involved. We have to do that now.
This is Thom Hartmann here on Fire Breathing Rob. Definitely check out his new book. Again, I just want to read that. And it is The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. Thom, as we move on to the last three questions, who do you see as up-and-coming progressives? We know Jamal Bowman won in New York. Cory Bush just won in Missouri. Obviously, there's AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and a couple other progressives. But do you see any other up-and-coming progressives in the party that you say maybe in 2024 they may primary Joe Biden, or if Joe Biden's not the nominee in 2024, they may primary Kamala Harris?
Or maybe Kamala Harris will have become one of those progressives, or maybe even Joe Biden will have become, you know,
right.
Hope springs eternal here, Rob. I do, up until the virus came along, you know, I show up around the country at local Democratic Party groups, typically to be the keynote speaker to help them raise some funds. And I am just constantly blown away by the quality of people whose names you've never heard, who are running for city council, who are running for state representative, who are running for county commissioner, you know, who are, I mean, this is the farm team. This is how people start out. This is where you begin in a political career, even if you're shooting for the White House. And you can't find a local Democratic Party, or at least I've never found a local Democratic Party anywhere in the country that doesn't have some real progressive superstars in it. And again, I don't think that it's so much a matter of having the person that, you know, we need to have a great leader or a great progressive come in. We just need to have a critical mass. We need a lot of progressives involved in this. So, you know, I think you know, if you were to ask me who are the rising stars right now, I would have gone through the list that you just said and add a few, you know, Ayanna Presley and a few others to it. But I don't. You know, I want to warn us all about salvationistic thinking, you know, thinking that we just need somebody who's going to save us, just some brilliant, charismatic person. No, we need us. We need to be showing it.
Well, Bernie stated that in the campaign as the slogan, not me, us. And he stated that throughout every speech that he made throughout the 2020 primary. With the last two questions, Thom, you are from Michigan. You went to Michigan State, as you said. You know the state of Michigan. What's going to happen in Michigan? We know in 2018 there was a blue wave in the state of Michigan. Do you see Joe Biden as the favorite in Michigan, or do you think it could be another upset if there is that depressed turnout like there was with Hillary Clinton in Flint and in Detroit, where a lot of black voters did not turn out for Hillary Clinton?
Well, there was 70,000 or 90,000 mostly black voters in Detroit who showed up and voted for everything on the ticket except president, which I'm not believing. You know, I'm believing that was election fraud, that, you know, somebody was messing with those machines. But in any case, Hillary Clinton was widely disliked among certainly the progressive faction within the Democratic Party. But, you know, she wasn't the best candidate. She didn't run a particularly good campaign. She didn't visit Michigan or Wisconsin. And Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. I mean, Joe Biden might be kind of your average middle-of-the-road Democrat, but he's not Hillary Clinton. He doesn't have her baggage. If anything, the baggage that he has is that he was Barack Obama's VP, and that's a positive baggage, not a negative baggage. You know, so I'm not so concerned about that. What I am concerned about are the lies and the cult conspiracy, the QAnon kind of conspiracies that are being spread by Facebook. And I think that the biggest challenge that we're going to have, I think the only reason that Donald Trump is president right now is because Facebook allowed this to happen in 2016. And I think that Facebook is allowing it to happen again. And that's the thing that distresses me the most, Rob.
Well, we see about with the QAnon, they speak about the pedophilia. We go back to 2017 where they talked about the Pizzagate with Hillary Clinton and the pedophilia ring with that. Obviously, that's a bunch of crap. But besides the point with that, are you worried that with Trump doing these dog whistles. He was out in Washington, D.C., raised the Bible up the first time was the wrong way, upside down. Then he put it up the right way. But he is encouraging these white supremacists, even in Kenosha, Wisconsin, saying that 17-year-old boy was able to do that. That was his right. And all these QAnon people believe everything that Trump says. He's like Jesus Christ to them. So with that said, are you worried about a race war or something building up like that if Trump does get reelected somehow?
I think it'll be much more complex than just that. But
Okay.
I can tell you that there are people on the right who have read the Turner Diaries or what's the other book? There's a second book that's more recent. Yeah. That basically lead to race wars, and they've become kind of the Bibles of these movements. It's not good, it's not healthy stuff. And the QAnon stuff is really just repackaged Nazism. The Nazis were promoting this thing called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which said that Jews were stealing children from Christians and taking their blood and making it into matzah, the bread that is used in the high holy holidays. That's essentially the same story that's being told about liberals and blacks and Hispanics by QAnon. They've repackaged the old protocols, and the protocols were the basis of the Nazi religion and the Nazi political party. And that's the thing that troubles me the most. And the whole this is your identity way of bringing people into cults is being used aggressively by these folks. It typically doesn't end well.
Right. So, Thom, as we end the interview with the last question, can you give millennials like me hope throughout this coronavirus, throughout all these health issues? We look at environmental issues again, with the labor issues, with unions, with people not having jobs right now. A lot of people still are unemployed. I don't care what President Trump says about the 8.4 unemployment rate. It's really probably near 10 or 11 at least. But a lot of people are going homeless too. So can you give the viewers a little bit of hope as we end the interview?
We have been through much worse, frankly. I don't think we've ever had a worse president, but we've been through worse crises. We had the Civil War, where literally people were killing their neighbors. We went through World War I and World War II with great deprivation. We went through the Spanish flu in 1917, 1918. This country's been to hell and back, and we're still here. And I think that's a testimonial to the animating vision of that created this country, that brought this country into being, which was the ideas that were laid down by people like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau during the Enlightenment, that people can govern themselves, that we don't need to have, to quote Hobbes, the iron fist of church or state, that we are decent at our core and we can make decisions for ourselves. We just need to stand up and seize that political power and return this country to its rational values.
Thanks so much for coming on the program. Definitely check out Thom's book. The new book is called The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. So, Thom, thanks again. I really do appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Rob. It's great being here with you. Thank you for having me.